new our new land acknowledgement that we have just written. Elsie, and I've forgotten to tell you about this, but this is a traditional thing that is being done across Canada in honor of our First Nations peoples. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territories of all the First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples who have been stewards of this land from time immemorial and who have chosen to share their knowledge and wisdom. As GRAN activists, we take this opportunity to commit ourselves to the struggle against the systems of oppression and colonialism that have dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their land and denied their rights to self-determination. This advocacy is essential to human rights work across the world. Now, my second privilege is to introduce Elsie Bokaba, who has a master's degree in psychology and is presently finishing a second master's in the philosophy department of Northwest University at Potchefstroom campus, which Mr. Google tells me is 123.5 kilometers southwest of Johannesburg. So if you know your geography, you know now where she is. She will follow this degree with a PhD. As you will soon learn, Elsie is an advocate for social justice and especially for those people whose voices have not been heard and therefore are being neglected. She's particularly interested in highlighting the unique environmental values of African grandmothers and what they can contribute to the environmental crisis facing the global South. She's been inspired by her own grandmothers, one who lived on a farm and the other who lived in the city. And perhaps we'll hear more about these two important women in her life. Elsie speaks 5 of the 11 official languages of South Africa: English, Zulu, Sepedi, Setswana, her maternal language, and also high school Afrikaans. So she only has 6 more languages to learn. And having spoken to her several times, she probably knows quite a lot about those other languages as well. I also know that she's recently celebrated her 25th birthday on Christmas Day. So thank you for joining us, Elsie, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Also, can I add that I didn't actually finish the master's in psychology, but went to actually pursue the one in philosophy. So thank you for the very wonderful introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen because I have slides for today. Okay.
While you're doing that, Elsie, could I just ask everyone to put themselves on mute, or I can mute everybody and then you can reopen your mic. Maybe that's the best thing, just for your presentation.
Okay.
I'm muting everybody and then Elsie will reopen her own mic. There we go. Elsie, we can't hear you if you're speaking to us. Oh, she
seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, I'm just readmitting her.
Sorry about that. Let's try that again. Okay, here we go. Can everyone see my screen?
We see a launch Zoom.
Okay, yeah. I'm just gonna do.
Yes.
Is it full screen on that side as well?
It's just coming back. Just one second. It says now I just don't see. Now it's black.
Okay.
It says I'm viewing your screen, Elsie, but there isn't anything on it. It's black.
Okay, let me try it again. Let me try sharing the PDF instead then. Is it sharing now?
Hasn't come up yet. So again, it says it's telling me I'm viewing your screen, but it's blank.
Okay, let me just quickly try the PDF version. Hopefully this one will work.
There we
Does
go.
it? Okay, let me just do this.
No, I'm not quite sure how I get to move. Can I move this away?
It's okay. I think I'll just move it from my side. Can everyone see? I think this is the best version I can get. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we also see your thumbnail, so I don't know.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think this is the best version I can get. Okay, I'll just start now because yeah, I don't think it'll get any better than this. So thank you again for everyone who's here today. Today I'll be sharing a piece of my master's thesis in environmental philosophy, specifically in the African context. And my thesis is being supervised by Dr. Leolandi Kutzer. She's also a very passionate environmental philosopher who specifically looks at animal rights in the context of Africa and Western. So the topic for my thesis is eco-maternalism, the contribution of GRAN maternal values to environmental discussions. So for today's content, I will be giving a brief context of myself and the reason why I chose this specific topic, and also specific people who have motivated me and kind of influenced my reason of thinking. I will also introduce briefly my thesis and also showcase the research question that has been guiding my whole thesis. I'll also look at the chapter outline and the progress that I have made. Specifically, I will concentrate on chapter 2 because it speaks a lot about the pre-colonial and colonial consequences that we see with regards to Black African elderly women. I'll also look at the significance of the thesis and speak more about my future research concerning my PhD and how GRAN kind of falls into all of this mess. So before I go on, I just wanted to make a few disclaimers too, actually. Well, the second one I've already said that my thesis is a work in progress. Hopefully I'll be submitting now in June. And also I wanted to highlight the jargon that I'm going to be using in terms of I'll be interchangeably using these words elderly women, African elderly women, grandmothers, Black grandmothers. And I specifically want to highlight the one on elderly women. In the African context, it's very important to show respect to your elders. So by referring to them as elderly is a sign of respect. And I hope this doesn't offend anyone in today. So as I said, just to give a bit of context into my line of thinking, how I've been influenced to specifically look at this community, I'm looking at Black African elderly women in the African context. And I've specifically chosen this group of people because firstly, I realized that these communities are the ones that are marginalized and often neglected when we consider environmental issues or environmental discussions that are made into place. And also, my own upbringing has actually influenced my reason for concern for these communities. And why I say this, as Phyllis was introducing me, I actually grew up in a nuclear home, but majority of my time I spent it with the grandmothers in my community. This was mainly because my parents were at the peak of their careers when I was born. So the people who actually really looked after me were, the grandmothers. Some memories which I have, some which I don't. And the people who influenced my decision making, my values, my core philosophies of life today, I would say are both my grandmothers from my paternal side and my maternal side. My grandmother from my paternal side resided, and I say resided in the past tense because she has passed now, but she resided in the province of Mpumalanga, and she lived on a farm. And so a lot of the things
If they go,
can you please mute your mic? That's my sister, by the way. So a lot of the times growing up, I would see how we would use our natural resources for food. And it was quite interesting. I learned a lot of what I would say survival wisdom when it comes to environment from her, because there was also that practical element that I could see. And my grandmother from my maternal side, she lived in more of a township, but the knowledge that she possesses with regards to the environment is so astonishing. She is literally the type to tell you if, for instance, there is a red full moon, she will tell you that, okay, this actually signifies something with regards to the climate. And it's so wonderful to see these type of things because it's such knowledges that are not really explored when it comes to environmental discussions in the 21st century. Okay, so to introduce my topic today. So the natural environment has been something that has always been contested over. And we see two specific perspectives, being in the instrumental perspective and intrinsic perspectives, that are often used when people are trying to kind of understand how we should behave towards the environment. The instrumental perspective kind of alludes to the sense that the environment, the natural environment is there for human purposes, to serve the humans. And we know that that's more of the anthropocentric type of thinking. And then we also have the intrinsic perspective where we have people who argue that the natural environment is something that needs to be preserved and kind of appreciates it just for its sacredness, right? And now these debates between the two have also kind of influenced the way in which people behave, the way we consume and use the resources, the natural resources. And as time has went, we've seen that this has led to contested debates, but also threatening behaviors towards the environment. This has then prompted some environmental discussions through conferences And if we look historically back to the 1950s or 1940s, there are environmental waves that are now starting to come up because they are different. The industrialization is now also changing. And we see organizations such as the IPCC also becoming one of the organizations, which I'll talk about later now, that come up during these environmental discussions or conferences. And during these conferences, discussions regarding the best suited approaches and management strategies are consulted and implemented. However, unfortunately, what happens also during these conferences, whether it is international conferences or national conferences regarding environmental discussions, there's always this underrepresentation of minority communities. And previously, we've seen that these communities allude to women of color or just women in general, people of color, children, and so forth. And in 2023, if we reflect back and consider the progression that has been made, we see that the first mention of these minority communities date back to 1992, when the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development was held in Brazil. And today, if we look at the progression that has been made, specifically looking at a very popular organization, which is the IPCC, known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we see that there has been a bit of change that is made. However, I feel like not enough is done, because what I've seen through literature is that there's a tendency to group all minority communities into this category of indigenous people. And we all know that indigenous can mean so many things, and just to group all of the minority groups into that is a bit unfair and doesn't truly represent great success to the progression that has been made. And specifically, if I look in my context of South Africa, there are frameworks that have been put into place, such as the framework and strategy toward gender mainstreaming in the environment sector. However, if we look at the actions that have been put into place, we see that the minority communities of certain people are not really there. If we consider specifically women, we know that it's women who are at a more privileged state. And what I mean by privilege is women who are educated, women who are of a certain class, which then all of those two things already costs out so many women in the African context. And so for me, I specifically look at a vulnerable community in the global south, specifically in the African context, which is often neglected, and that is the Black elderly woman, especially in the rural outskirts of various African countries. Okay. What has led to me looking at these communities is that with guidance of the intersectional conceptual framework, I've seen that intersectional factors such as race, gender, age, and class need to be raised when it comes to the people that represent us in these environmental conferences, where adaptation strategies and mitigation solutions are made there. What has also made me see this gap is that Black grandmothers are potentially exposed to what I call triple oppression. Triple oppression comes from the understanding of double oppression, but for triple oppression, I say that the Black grandmother has been oppressed not only by the white man coming from the colonial powers, but also from the Black man aligning with the white man during coloniality, and also currently with the exclusion that then counts for the triple factor, the exclusion in environmental matters that then counts for the triple factor in the post-colonial era. And as I've written here, that this sense of triple oppression has been perpetuated in the exclusion or minimal inclusion in environmental sectors that matter. Because in these sectors, this is where the decisions are made and specific approaches that sometimes hardly work in given the different contexts are made. And so if we look at literature when it comes to environmental philosophy, we know that what I've highlighted in terms of Black women being oppressed, or women in general being oppressed when it comes to environmental matters, is something that has been highlighted in theories of ecofeminism, and some African feminists also speak on this. However, I have specifically chosen the theory of eco-maternalism, one which has been populated by Lillian Chilo Siwila, who is actually a religious scholar more than a philosopher. However, in her theory of eco-maternalism, this theory is developed within a matrilineal context, and she also recognizes the impacts that grandmothers have in the Black African context, and the high status that they're often regarded as in comparison to society that often forgets about them. And here I also put on a quote which I thought was very interesting from her work that I placed here, which says that as an African woman brought up in a matrilineal context where grandmothers played a very important role to define a girl's womanhood, I identify with the context in which this article is located, her article. A grandmother's presence created an opportunities for girls to observe how Indigenous knowledge is passed on from the women to the young girls. And Siwila specifically looks at, this idea of womanhood and how the grandmother influences the young girls and their upcoming, and how environmental knowledge is passed down thereof. But for me, I take it a bit further because I say, yes, we have these grand maternal values that come from our grandmothers. However, these values are not just passed onto the young girls, but are passed more to the different generations in the society. Because in the African context, we know that, for instance, South Africa, there's a lot of female-headed households, and a lot of these households consist of grandmothers. So these grandmothers are influencing generations upon generations. In Siwila's work, she further alludes that the narratives and teachings reflect the realities of how Indigenous knowledge embedded in nature is held worthy by Indigenous people and passed on from generation to generation. Thus, the grandmother analogy is relevant. And so for me, once again, the theory of eco-maternalism, if I can expand on it a bit, comes from the model of maternalism. The model of maternalism alludes to the understanding that the woman's essentialist nature as caring and compassionate, women's innate desire to improve the world of their children, and the transformative power of maternal love is always present, but in the environmental context, which then makes them good advocates for environmental issues. However, it does not deny fundamental notions of ecofeminism, which these ecofeminism notions allude to the fact that these androcentric dualistic thinking are the ones that keep on the subjugation of women and nature, right? And it alludes to the fact that we often are told that women are feminine, and so is nature, right? Nature is feminine. And the connection between the two then leaves both in the position of being subordinated by the males. However, in the African context, teachings and philosophies are passed down from generation to generation, as I mentioned, and many times the grandmothers do this. I understand that one of the critiques of this model that I'm currently using is that usually ecofeminists or other feminists are in dispute of the fact that this theory kind of perpetuates this idea that there's biological determinism when it comes to environmental matters, which then assumes that because of the woman's nature to nurture, they are more closer to nature. And so are more categorically imperfect specimens to nurture nature, right? However, for me, I use this theory because I think this theory can speak to the lived experiences of Africans, as they are the ones who are constantly being influenced by our grandmothers. And I do also understand that this then is a gap in literature, right? That there isn't necessarily an appropriate theory for our grandmothers, but this. Okay, then next is the general research question that has been guiding my thesis, which is, what are the environmental values that African grandmothers possess, and how can these contribute to tackling the environmental crisis faced by the global south? And by environmental crisis, I mean different environmental challenges, which I'll speak on in my chapter 4. So the main chapters then are firstly in chapter 2, I look at the historical context. So I specifically look at the pre-colonial times, and then I look at the colonial times with regards to the roles of women and, then our grandmothers as well. And why I have focused on women in general is because there is no literature, well, or not there is no, but there's very little literature when it comes to grandmothers. You can literally count them with both hands. So from the information then I get about our women in the society during these times, I can then deduct what the roles of then the elderly have been, and also the values that they have placed there. In my chapter 3, I look at the rehabilitation of maternal values, the ones that I would have found from those that have been lost from the pre-colonial times. In my last chapter, then I look at then the pressing environmental challenges that are faced specifically by Black elderly women in the rural communities, and how these values can prompt environmental discussions regarding what are the appropriate, approaches to these problems that they face. And so for my chapter 2, the first half of my chapter 2, I look at the pre-colonial times, specifically, as I said, the roles of women and grandmothers. The countries, or Africa is divided. So the countries I kind of look at is the ones in the south, west, and the eastern parts of Africa. I've purposely left out the northern part of Africa, firstly because historically they have had a different experience when it comes to colonialism that I see that the west, south, and east cannot relate to. We also know that the religious aspect of it, knowing that there's a lot of, they're influenced by Arabic principles, which is not prominent when it comes to the 3 that I mentioned. And the countries that I've considered are Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Kenya, and Uganda. And I hope you guys will later on read my thesis, you'll see that many of these countries are interned in their previous tribes, if I might call it. So they're not always stated as, for instance, I look at Yoruba land in Nigeria, so it's not always going to say Nigeria, but yeah, I hope that makes sense. And what I've thus found is that there are different aspects that our women and grandmothers have played, and they have had value in these aspects. Firstly, if we look at the religious or spiritual side, they have played roles when it comes to diviners. We also see that there have been a lot of prophets in that age and time. And women were also considered as people who are much more closer to God because of their powers to bring onto life on earth. And when it comes to the economic state, we see that they played a huge role when it comes to markets. So in terms of bartering, we see that during this time, they were actually given a lot of freedom and power to kind of rule a lot of the markets. We also see that there's a lot of them that are placed in leadership positions to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And if there's any hiccups during the market times, then they would be the ones that kind of brings in the order into the chaos. We also see that others are known as people who give traditional herbs to those who are going to the market to ensure that their market trip is a success. So there has been a lot of dependence when it comes to them economically. We also see that they actually played, I think this is one of the biggest roles that they played when it comes to agriculture. They were in charge of a lot of the happenings that were happening on, the agricultural sector. And the freedom also is that they had the freedom to, if, for instance, someone from the Zulu clan in South Africa wanted to barter with someone in Botswana, they had the freedom to do that, and also keep whatever they had bartered for. And so they were also, them being in the agricultural sector during this time tells you a lot about how fond or how much of a respectable statue they had, because for them to be in that sector, that means there's a lot of trust that goes into that, because the agricultural sector was the most important for all tribes and clans, because this meant that they depended on these women for their food security. We also see that they were involved politically. We see a lot of them, especially the elderly, were involved as council members. So they gave advice to people who we would call as kings now. We see a lot of queendoms as well, and we see a lot of their influence in the political structure, especially in what we would call the matriarchy tribes, which a lot of them were present, if I'm not mistaken, in, I think it was Ghana. Yeah, but I stand to be corrected with that. And then we also see that they had a social role to play, which was that they were teachers, right? So we see that actually both the grandfather and the grandmother were teachers, but a lot of the times that responsibility of teaching the children on, culture and so forth was bestowed onto the grandmother. And then for my second half, I look at colonialism. So how have their position or their positions, how have those changed now? How do we view our grandmothers now, our Black grandmothers? And firstly, we know that colonialism was, there was a sense of domination of Black people. However, I want to point out that I feel that this was not just a race agenda, but it was a gender agenda as well. And colonialism has to be seen in the two in order to understand how the Black elderly woman is affected today. And two concepts that I think is very important to mention is that of patriarchy and capitalism. Firstly, with patriarchy, we know that the concept of gender was very different to what the Western had. And obviously, with the subjugation of Black people, that meant that their culture was also going to be diluted, which means the concept of gender would also be diluted, right? And we also see that there's this alignment that was made possible by the colonial powers, where they aligned themselves specifically with Black men and a lot of the Black men who had power in order to make sure that their agenda was a success. And this alignment with Black people then kind of created what I called a gender and race hierarchy. And this gender and race hierarchy then placed Black elderly women at the bottom of this hierarchy. I also have noticed that there is the sense of infantilization of the elderly women. And how I've actually come to understand this is that in the African context, in pre-colonial, the Black elderly woman was very much so involved in their society or community as a whole. However, this was very foreign for the colonial powers because when they came into the African space, they couldn't understand how much power was kind of given to these elderly women. And why I say that is because we see that with countries that have colonized Africa, that a lot of them depend on what we call old age homes, right? And old age homes has this sense of structure that daycares also have. So you are told when to eat, you're told when to sleep, you're told what to do for the day. So this sense of structure kind of infantilizes the elderly women or the elderly in general, because old age homes are open to everyone. And so this kind of thinking was then also diluted into the African context, which then resulted in, us seeing our elderly women as these people who are fragile, who are just, passive people that we always need to help, and which is not the case. We also see that because of patriarchy, a lot of the women, not a lot, but women in general were declined the privilege of being educated. And how this has affected the elderly women today is that because of the lack of, being literate, we then see that they're not able to express themselves or express their conditions as much as they would love to. So if we see in the environmental context, for instance, when we look at climate change, there's always jargon that is used that is so hectic that if even a person that is educated and literate sometimes shies away from. So if now we consider a generational neglect or the not having the privilege of being educated, we see that such topics become something that is intimidating for someone like that, right? And by reality of that, then the Black elderly woman then becomes what? Marginalized. And then for capitalism, with the introduction of colonialism, there was also a form of imperialism that came into place, right? Because of the resources that Africa has had or have. And so we see that something like the body then becomes something that is very powerful, if I can say in the sense, because then the body kind of signifies the labor market. And what I mean by that is then the body then becomes the money, because certain, as I said, industrialization then took place, right? And if we look at the job opportunities during that time, it needed people who were structured in a certain physique. And if we look at labor power or body labor power, then we see that the Black elderly woman is disregarded and marginalized and neglected in that sense because they don't fit that category that capitalism is looking for. We also see that throughout the years, women have been denied economic opportunities. Even just owning land has been such an unfortunate thing. We even see it from the history of Zimbabwe specifically, that this has been, a literal fight for years. I think it still is even today. And it's also still very unfortunate because even with the land that they have, it's not like they can do a lot because of the climate issues that we face now. Okay, now for my chapter 3, it's not going to be that long. So I've kind of started with my chapter 3, but with my chapter 3, now I look at the values that one could deduct from the roles that these women played in the pre-colonial times, which is these aspects. And I see from those aspects that from the economic space, we can see that there's the value of harmony and resilience that we can take. And how that becomes an environmental value is that we know that if there's no harmony between globally, first of all, and nationally, then there aren't any environmental approaches that are successful. There aren't many of those that are going to be implemented or found. And on top of that, we know that resilience, in a way, plays a part because with the survival wisdom that Black elderly women have had, this can actually improve the existing approaches and adaptation strategies that has already been implemented, specifically when we look at the agricultural sector. And political, this is, I placed here leadership because we now see a different version of leadership, right? I think when we say a leader, immediately there's a picture that we have in our minds, and really is that picture of a Black elderly woman. And why this becomes an environmental value is because there's a sense of leadership that is needed to lead nations, first of all, but also to lead those generations that you're passing knowledge down onto. And so leadership also comes into play because with their sense of leadership, they can then enforce the survival wisdom on the different communities that they come across. We also see the environmental value of honor, which I'm still working on. And then social, which is that of interconnectedness. I think the Black elderly women understand this interconnectedness that exists between the human and the natural environment, right? And by placing that knowledge of our interconnectedness as humans with the natural environment, I think we can then start implementing or making decisions that are not only beneficial to the human, but also beneficial to the ecosystem at large. Okay. Then for my chapter 4, as I said, this is still in progress. I looked at the different environmental challenges, specifically the challenges that are like pressing currently. And also we see that the vast majority of African elderly women are still heavily reliant on natural resources as their source of life. As given the outcry of lack of resources in African countries, I mean, this is not new news. In Africa alone, since COVID-19, food inadequacy has risen to 278 million. Yeah. And if we look at South Africa alone, we see that reports show that there's 2.1 billion reports regarding food inadequacy and their lack of food security. And I also wrote down here, which is very important to consider, is that this is 1 in 5 households in rural areas that are affected in this 2.1 million that has been included here. And the pressing matters for me then becomes air pollution, because in the rural outskirts, we also see, especially in South Africa, we see that there are, a lot of factories and mines that are built around those communities. And so that obviously then plays into air pollution. We also see soil degradation. We also see something that's very interesting that has been happening a lot is floodings, which come from the heavy rainfalls. And a perfect example that I thought of is the KwaZulu-Natal, which is KZN in South Africa. There was in April 22, there were heavy floodings that happened. And even in 2023, they weren't as major as April 2022, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of damage that happened, and a lot of the damage has been seen by cane growers. Those are the people who are most affected by this. And we see farmers as well in general have been complaining of that. And for me, this also made me realize that rural people as well, or people from the rural areas, sorry, especially what I mentioned, the Black elderly women, what about them? Why aren't we seeing more of how this affected them? Because recently when I went to KZN, I was in the suburbs of KZN, and those places were still not attended to that were affected by the floods. So you can just imagine then in the rural areas, those places have probably been forgotten about as well. And that's where a lot of the Black elderly women reside, unfortunately. We also see these floodings then also affected in the space of Kenya as well, I think in 2022 or 23. Yeah. And water quality has also been a major thing. It has been a major problem when it comes to these areas. Now, the significance of this thesis, firstly, I'm attempting to look at the gap in an African environmental philosophy literature that neglects the grandmother as significant contributors to the environment. Theories on ecofeminism, ecomonism, African feminism, all of these theories, I say that they speak to a certain group of African women, and the African elderly women does not always, fit into what they're saying, even with the ecofeminism that is, taken in the third world context. There's also a lot of global environmental concerns, and these concerns and the needs, they have to be considered from all spheres of life for possible approaches and solutions to environmental problems. I think we also owe a form of environmental justice to this community that I've mentioned. As I've said, there's been a rippling effect of colonialism that still, even today, unfortunately, affects them. We also need to change our perspectives and attitudes towards African elderly women to start seeing them as active agents in the society instead of seeing them as passive people that always need the sense of saving. Okay. And so for my future research and where GRAN lies in all of this is later after my thesis, I hope to develop an appropriate theory that aligns with elderly women's contribution to environmental matters. And this theory will obviously be drawing from theories of ecofeminism and ecomaternism, theories which I think fails to capture this accurately, this sense of contribution. I'll also be focusing on the peculiar approach grandmothers have taken when it comes to activism and surviving decades of climate change, because climate change did not just start happening 5 or 10 years ago. And so capturing this survival wisdom then becomes very important. I'll also offer testimonial I hope to offer testimonial and epistemic justice, as these type of things are that have not been afforded to the Black elderly or the Black African elderly women. We haven't been hearing their voices, and we need them at the forefront in order for us to kind of overcome this oppressive regime that they have been facing for a while now. And so then GRAN comes in, as I use GRAN as a success model to showcase evidence what I've mentioned above, that there are grandmothers who are actively participants in activism and who advocate to share their wisdom when it comes to what do you call this now? Environmental wisdom, yes. And I would also like to conduct possible interviews with people from GRAN who are actively involved in, the activism, and also stimulate conversation between, people from GRAN and also participants that I'll be finding from my context, which is the African elderly women, to also show how we need a stimulation of conversation when it comes to these groups, whether it is nationally or internationally. Thank you. I am done.
I think Diane is going to thank Elsie, for this phenomenal
I think we're going to the questions first, aren't we?
questions first. Sorry. Mhm.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, so maybe rather than put them in the chat, if you have a question, if you can just raise your hand or wave your hand and I will call on you. Don't see everyone, but or just I'm not seeing everyone. So if you can just say your name if you have a question. Oh, Diane.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Elsie if she's aware of the fact in Ghana they have started to have queen mothers in the north where there is so much patriarchy, and that is actually from the Ghanaian government to empower women, because in the south we have them. The women are valued and have quite a bit of power in the citizenry. They're really well respected, and so there's a division in Ghana between the two types. Do you know about that, Elsie?
So what I've seen, no, I don't know about that specifically right now, but what I've seen when it comes to actually Ghana and Kenya, those are the two countries I would say in my research that I've seen they've had a long history trying to kind of fight off patriarchy, because the patriarchy that exists there, I wouldn't say it's the same as South Africa, because the patriarchy that exists there is also enforced in the different land laws that they have and so forth. So I don't know specifically about that you're mentioning now, but I think if they're doing that, then that is actually a positive sign, because queen mothers were also people that were very respected in the pre-colonial times. So to actually acknowledge that these people were there and we still want their presence today, I think it's a huge step for a country like Ghana to be, yeah.
I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Go back to it.
Just
Okay. Yes, Anne Young is asking, does the organization Women, WOMIN,
which organization is that? Can maybe she elaborate on it? Because I'm
Anne,
not.
would you like to ask your question maybe? It's WOMIN.
Mm,
Does it neglect to recognize the value of elderly women in their activities?
I am not really familiar with this organization, but I've seen that, if I can just speak of the, organizations that are there that say that they speak or they are activists when it comes to the elderly. First of all, it's different in the sense that if I compare it to GRAN actually has grandmothers that are leading the organization. But rarely will you find that in a lot of the other organizations, especially in the African context. I can't remember which one I saw now. And a lot of the organizations that I've came across actually kind of focuses more on the health aspect. And what I mean by that is the HIV and AIDS pandemic that has been happening for years. So we tend to see that the concerns that are more focused are more onto that. But when it comes to environmental discussions, those are often neglected. Yeah. I just need a little bit of context. But I'll be sure to check out women, because maybe I'll find something that I didn't have before.
Any other questions? Actually, Elsie, I was going to ask you, your grandmother's definitely had a huge impact on you. And I wondered if you could tell us, what do you think might be one of their main pieces of advice that they've given you?
Oh, that is a tough one. Sure. Sure. You are talking about like phenomenal women who have said so much.
Yeah.
I'm like trying to pick just one.
Well, no, several.
think I think one that I would say I'm using now is them acknowledging that they have space. And what I mean by that is in and them acknowledging that they have space in the society has kind of also influenced me into not being afraid to step in as a Black young, woman in the different spaces I find myself in. Because as a Black young woman, it's very easy to, fall into your own thoughts and get swooped out by imposter syndrome, especially in the different spaces where it is male dominated, if I would say that. So I think by them just, holding themselves with so much grace and acknowledging how much space that they hold has kind of, I would say, has influenced me a lot.
Yeah, that's lovely. Anyone else? Are there any other questions? Do we have time for more, Linda? Or no?
Probably, I guess our time is kind of coming to an end. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess so. Okay.
Well, I have the privilege of having the lovely job of thanking you, Elsie. This has been so wonderful. One of the things that you said that really makes me think about stuff here at home is the way that we're treating our elderly, and you comparing it to having old age homes and then comparing it to a daycare. And I've never heard that mentioned before. And you feel that as an older woman when your children start to, help you cross the street, or, oh, mom, you shouldn't carry that, or what, you're going to do that? So I really, I appreciate all that you've thought about older women. And first of all, for finding us in the first place. I don't even know how you managed that, but that's wonderful. And you've given us so much to think about. And we've been wanting to learn more about the effects of colonialism. So you've helped us get onto that path. And we still have a lot to learn, of course, but we look forward to having a relationship with you in the future. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. And thank you for all the questions as well. Thank you for the engagement.
And then I think, yeah, that's great. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words in closing. Hi, I'm Linda Kulkarni. I'm co-chair of GRAN. And Elsie, that was such a wonderful presentation, powerful. And just thank you so much for this work that you're doing. It's just so important. And, I just learned so much today. So, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to say a few words to everybody. We're right on the cusp of International Development Week. It's February 4 to 10. And it's an opportunity for us to raise our voices and to let our political leaders know that international development is so important. We do have some advocacy actions developed for that we're asking if you could spend a bit of time and send messages to our Minister of International Development and our Finance Minister. So, we've got a wonderful postcard that was just created recently that they would love you to send to Minister Huzan, just elevating the need for more support for food security and for small-scale farmers in Africa. And right after this presentation today, GRAN members will be receiving another email with a couple of messages that you can send to both Minister Huzan again, Minister Guibo, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and our Finance Minister, because not only is this International Development Week, but it's also in the lead up to the new federal budget where we're really asking for an increase in funding. So watch for that coming to your mailbox. Also in the chat, I've put the GRAN website and and the homepage for the GRAN website. And if you go there and just click on Take Action, you'll see both of these advocacy opportunities listed there with some really simple directions. Just click, modify a message, add your own personal touch, and send it off. We know that GRAN voices are heard, and the louder we speak, the more of us that speak, the more powerful, the message is. So I just thank you for being here today and for all the great work that you're doing. And I want a special thanks to our facilitators today, who without their work, this webinar wouldn't have happened. So to Phyllis, Diane, Kathy, and Janet, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gran.
And yeah, thanks again, Elsie.
Thank you, Elsie.
Yeah, we'll be in touch for sure. Many more conversations to happen.
I hope so.
Yeah, for
Good luck
sure.
with your thesis.
Yes.
Thank you. That's the most important good luck I need right now.
Yes. You're such a busy young woman, so really appreciate you taking the time for us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for coming.